The fatal flaw in Mercedes diesel engines. I think that a lot of people love the idea of having an older Mercedes diesel that lasts forever. And for the most part, this is true. But there is a bearing located in your Mercedes diesel's vacuum pump that can kill the engine and basically turn it into a giant boat anchor within seconds. So today we're going to talk about the vacuum pump bearing. Now, this is a vacuum pump from an OM603 engine, but this same vacuum pump was used on 601 engines, which are used in the 190D 2.0 and 2.2, 602 engines, which were used in the 190D 2.5, both turbo and non-turbo, and the 300D 2.5, 603 engines, which were used in the 300D W124 series, the 300 SDL, 350 SD and SDL, the 350 GD, and any other vehicle that had the 603 engine in it. And finally, the OM606 engine and related engines such as the 604 and 605. And no, there's no escaping it. Even the W140 series cars with the 603 engines had this problem. So let's talk about this vacuum pump bearing and why it was so bad. And we're also going to mention some of the earlier models that were afflicted by this, although not to the same severity. So this pump has a little bearing, and this bearing is driven off of the injection pump timing device. Now, this is a replacement bearing, or a replacement pump, I should say, because there's no such thing as a replacement bearing. You have to change the whole pump. As you can see, there are no little balls here. There's a metal cage that covers up the balls. But if you have one of these pumps and you pull it off, and instead of seeing a metal cage here, you see little balls, or you see a plastic brown shield that covers up the little balls, you have one of the defective pumps. If you see this little ridge, this nice little metal bearing cage where the balls are contained in the center instead of at the sides, you have one of the bad pumps. And here's what the bad pumps do. Eventually that bearing falls apart and drops little tiny balls into your timing chain. If you are not lucky, the balls will get into your timing chain teeth, or in the gear teeth that drive the timing chain, and they will jam the chain and jam the gear, causing the chain to break, instantly breaking your camshaft and causing your vehicle to stop right then and there. These little balls will usually be ejected through the front of the oil pan or the timing case, doing even more damage, requiring that the engine come out and get a major, how shall we say, cylinder head rebuild, front timing cover, and gear replacement. And as these engines become more popular and people are finding ways to get more and more power out of them, this is a real problem, because most people who do this kind of work actually are not aware of this flaw. Because who cares when you're making 500 horsepower, right, guys? The second problem, though, can be a little bit more devastating, and that's when the vacuum pump starts to fail silently. Instead of dropping all of its bearings, it'll drop a few little bearings. And those bearings will end up in the oil pan, and eventually the oil pump will suck them up. Now, these little ball bearings will get sucked past the oil pump screen. They are small enough to just barely work their way into the oil pump screen. We're not talking about a partial, like a partial, like, oh, the ball's halfway through the screen. No, all the way into the screen, all the way into the oil pump. Oil pump gears have like thousandths of a millimeter of clearance. So when you introduce one ball bearing into your oil pump gears, That's it. The oil pump fractures, quits pumping oil, and then your crankshaft gets cooked within seconds. How did I learn about this stuff? Now, I'm not talking about theoreticals here, because I used to see forum posts all the time about vacuum pump failures. And there are a lot of people that were too lazy to change the $200 at the time vacuum pump and just let it go, and then it would break. This turned out to be kind of a... Sorry, it's been a long weekend. This turned out to be kind of a bad idea for a lot of guys, but people who didn't know about this and were not well advised by their Mercedes dealership usually let the pump go a lot longer and would drop ball bearings. And the number one failure that I observed, which I observed early on in my career on an E300 and a 300 SDL, was the oil pump failure and the subsequent crank bearing failure. And when the oil pump fails, it doesn't fail all the way, but it fails enough to stop providing adequate oil pressure to the crank bearings. You'll notice that the oil pressure doesn't get over 20 psi. And then they say, I remember that a shop out in, we'll just say they're like off of Aloma Avenue in like the UCF East Orlando area. They said to one of my customers, your car's just old and it needs a turbo. So they put a turbo on it and blamed the turbo for the low oil pressure. On no 603 engine will a bad turbo cause low oil pressure. It's always a vacuum pump problem. And the most common engines that had this failure were 603 engines, although I've seen it on 601, 602, and 606 engines. On the 606 engines, we had a 95 E300 coming. It was a really clean car. And the crank was destroyed. Why was the crank destroyed? Because something had destroyed the oil pump. Why was the oil pump destroyed? Because the vacuum pump fell apart. Somehow it didn't get into the chain. Usually on the 606 engines, you'd get a couple of broken timing chain teeth and the thing would rattle to a halt. So if you have a 606 engine, this is something you need to check. Now, where do I get one of these vacuum pumps? Well, this is a real problem because they're a discontinued item from Mercedes. So you have to find either used good ones that are updated, or you can find new old stock new ones, which are not easily available, but they do exist, or you can buy the Pierre Chinese pump, which is a trade-off. Now, why would I run the Chinese pump? Well, in the case I can't find an NOS one or a good used one, it's a good last resort. But one of the things that I want to investigate, and maybe one of you can tell me this, is if the vacuum pump from the E320 CDI, which is, I think, the OM642 engine or something like that, correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not as familiar with newer MB engines, if that pump will actually fit. But you got to do something. You can't just run around with that thing. So don't procrastinate. Make sure your vacuum pump is the updated version. Now, here's a way to know if it's the updated version or not. Updated versions have large diameter Torx head screws in the front, not little ones. Because in the E300, they had little tiny ones. These are about twice the size. So the good ones have the larger Torx screws. That's all I can tell you. If you guys like this video, please click the subscribe button and maybe share it with a friend of yours who likes classic Mercedes as well. Hopefully you never have this issue, because you bring one of these to us and say fix it, it gets expensive. So we'll see you guys in the next video, and try to stay on top of that vacuum pump.